Hi everyone, welcome back. Let's write some more Leetcode today. Today we are solving set matrix zeros. So we are given an eminent integer matrix, and if an element is 0, then we want to set that element's row and column to 0. So if we look at this example, this is 0, so we will set the entire row to 0 and the entire column to 0, and the result will look like this. If you see this example, this is 0, so we will set this to 0 and this whole column to 0. And since this is 0, we will set this entire row to 0 and this entire column to 0, and it will look like this as the result. So now that we have seen some examples, let's get to how we can solve this problem. So how we can solve this problem is we will search through the grid twice in left to right order from top to bottom. So we'll search this row, then this row, then this row all the way to the end. And if we see a 0 in the green section, then we will just set a row 0 variable to true. If it's in the blue section, then we will set the first column and first row of that element to 0. So for example, if this is 0, then we will set this to 0 and this to 0. And if this is 0, then we will set the first row to 0 and it's already in the first column, so this is what we will do. And if it is in the green section, we will just set this row 0 variable to true. We cannot set this to 0 because it may screw it up later as we go through it the second time around. So after setting the zeros the second time go around, we will first check this area. If any of these have their first element equal to 0, then we will set them to 0. So for here, we will set this to 0, 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 and this to 0. And then after checking that, we will check this area. If this is equal to 0, if this is equal to 0, then we will set this whole thing down to 0. So that is why we have a row 0 variable. Because if we don't and we set this to 0, then maybe we shouldn't set this to 0, but then we would, and that would lead to the wrong result. So after checking for this area, thirdly, we will check for the row 0 variable if it is true or not. So if row 0 is true, like right here, then we will set the whole row to 0. And just remember, we need to check in this 3 order. Everything not in the first row nor first column, so this area. And then we need to check matrix 0, 0, so this one. And then we can check row 0. So basically, we first check if we need to set any of these to 0, then we need to check we need to set this to 0, and then we check do we set row 0 to all zeros. So let's go over this example real quick. So first we will look down, we see there's a 0, so we can set row 0 to true. And then we look, nothing here, we have a 0 here, so we set the first row to 0 and the first column to 0. And now we look our second go around, so we look at these elements. This element, we see that the first row is 0, so we set this to 0. Look here, we see that the first row is 0, so set this to 0. And then we look here, we see that the first column is 0, so we set this to 0. Look here, see the first row, first column, they're all 0, so when you set this to 0. So then we check, do we need to set this column to 0? We do not, so we leave it as is. And then we see that row 0 is true, so we need to set the first row to 0. So 0 and 0, and this will be our result. So the time complexity would be O of n times m, where n is the number of rows and m is the number of columns, because that is the number of elements that we will look through. And the space complexity would be O of 1, because we are not using any extra space. So now let's get to the coding part. So first we will set the variable rows to the number of rows. So it will be the length of matrix, and columns will be the length of matrix of element 0. So that will be the number of columns, and then we need to initialize row 0 as false. Now we will look through the grid the first time, so R in range rows and C in columns. If the row happens to be greater than 0, then we will need to set the first element to 0. So the first row to 0 and the first column to 0. So matrix R0 equal to 0 and matrix 0C is equal to 0. Otherwise, don't edit anything but set the variable row 0 to true. So now it will be our second go around, and then we will look at everything after the first row and first column first. So C in range 1 the columns, and if it has anything in the first row that's equal to 0 or anything in the first column equal to 0, we will set that element to 0. Equal to 0, then we need to set matrix of RC to 0. Now we can look at the top left. If that is equal to 0, then we can set the entire column to 0. So So for R in range rows, we will set matrix of R 0 to 0. So that will be the first column. And now we can check if row 0 is equal to true. If it is true, then we need to set the first row to 0. So it will be for C in range columns and matrix of 0 C equal to 0. And let's see if it works. Okay, perfect. Hope this was helpful. Thank you all for watching. If you have any other questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I hope to see you all again soon.